This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, I'm going to share and share my screen, and then we'll share this, and we'll kind of jump into tonight's discussion in chapter 8. Um, are you guys enjoying this? Any general comments before we get started? What did you think about chapter 8, just in general, before we kind of get into it? Anybody? Anything that you didn't expect, or anything that surprised you in what you ran across there in chapter 8? Probably not. I mean, those of you who have been with me for a while, we've covered some things that are related to the topic in chapter 8 in our previous discussions in prophecy and presentations in prophecy, and we'll probably have a little bit more to say about that in upcoming sessions on Sunday. But this is a chapter that really deals with, if you really had to sort of summarize this chapter in a very, very, very succinct way, it's dealing with what sometimes referred to as the red-green axis. And the red-green axis, or maybe you might have heard it red-green alliance, but it's really more like an axis. The red-green axis is one way of referring to the alignment between the red, the Marxists, the secular left, and the green, the Islamic world. And so that's the two. That's what's represented by those two colors. And so they have, as this book and as this chapter points out, they have some common objectives. They have some common alliances between them, or common points of alliance between them. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we work our way through the questions tonight. But that's really what this particular chapter is all about: is the red-green axis, and or what's referred to as the red-green axis. So let's just kind of go ahead and get started, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at the questions. I sent them out, I think, Monday night, if I'm not mistaken, and we'll run through these, I think, in pretty good haste, or not haste, but we'll run through them at a pretty good clip, and we'll just make the best of it. Okay. All right. So do you agree with Lutzer's observation on page 207, which is the first page of the chapter, as he opens this chapter, that I need to emphasize? So what he says at the very bottom of page 207, he says, to begin, I need to emphasize that the majority of Muslims who live in America have come to accept Western values and have no interest in attacking America's religious history or economic system. They benefit from the West's freedom and opportunities, and he says they hope that they will continue to do so. Now, first of all, my question is, do you agree with his statement that the majority of Muslims who live in America have come to accept Western values and have no interest in attacking America's religious history or economic system? Um, just want to get your thoughts. Do you agree with that statement or not?
Hey,
Anybody?
Steve,
Mm-hmm.
so it's kind of a long answer to this, but it's a very good question, and I thought about this before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I don't think it's a simple yes or no, because I don't think that anyone really knows, because let me start by saying, I think, and again, I don't mean to stereotype, but I think you could, at least the way I categorize Muslim people, I think there's like, three camps of them. I think that there are some, Muslims that have, just become assimilated into Western customs. They're really non-practicing Muslims, and they definitely benefit, from Western capitalism. And then there are it's like another camp that I believe are true Muslim hardline believers, but they are being deceptive in their practices, and they are basically pretending to be kind of in line with Western values, because they don't want to reveal what Islam's true goal is. And then, like, there's a third camp that are just the um, extremists, which make, no attempt to hide, the true motivations of Islam.
Hmm.
So now, and so, to say, who's in the majority is very difficult because, um, unlike Christianity, which there's no, teachings from the scripture, which says that, like, one of the tenets of the of Christianity is to kind of hide your true motivations. Well, that's like a big part of Islam, is that, when you are, with, people of different beliefs, um, it's okay and sometimes encouraged to, hide your true motivations, with the intent of deceiving, more people for a larger gain later.
Hmm. Yeah, what's that term? Do you recall that term, Caleb?
Tachism, or I forget
Takia.
Yeah.
Takia.
Oh, yeah, tequila. Just think of tequila, but it's not quite tequila because they don't believe in drinking. So, yeah, it's called tequila. And yeah, Sharon was right, tequila. Yeah, so that's a really good. I think that's a good summarization of some the three different categories. I know Joel Rosenberg has spoken to this issue, and he's categorized the Islamic world similarly. And the three classifications I would use are very similar to what you came up with, Caleb. The first category I would call nominal. They're really just Muslim because it's like Muslim because that's the society, that the culture, family, tradition that they were born into. But they're not necessarily really seriously practicing. That's just all they know, right? So there's a lot of those. There's a big segment of Islam that is in fact of that nature. There's another category of Islam, and that's maybe practicing Islam, and probably that within that category there's two subcategories. One would be, to your point, the subcategory that's practicing taqiyya. They're actually practicing Muslims. They believe in Islam, and they're practicing also deceit when they're out in the world, dealing with Westerners. And then there's the other category that's not really trying to deceive anybody. They're just out practicing their religions, and they happen to be relatively peaceful, and they're not jihadists, and they're not interested in war. They're not interested in killing people, that sort of thing. Then there's the third category that's what Joel Rosenberg calls, and what others call, as a matter of fact, I think Lutzer uses the term in his chapter, Islamists. And those would be the quote unquote radical, what the West is calling the radical Islam. The truth is, from the vantage point of Islam and from the vantage point of the Islamic religion, anyone who's not in the category of practicing um, uh, Islam with a desire to dominate, consistent with more of the Islamists' view of the world, they would really be apostate. So there's really, from their perspective, there's just two categories, and that's apostates and Islamists. That's right. And they don't consider Islamists. They just consider them people who are practicing Islam according to a correct understanding of the Quran and the Hadith. So, so you have it's to your point, it's a kind of it's not an easy answer. But the reason I asked that question, posed that question, is that this is a second question, and it's a question I did not put on the screen for a reason. I wanted to just hear your responses. And the second question is, what will the nominal, what I'm calling nominal Muslims, which is the larger category of Muslims, what will the nominal Muslims do, and what will the Muslims who are just practicing Islam from, a kind of a peaceful perspective, what will they do when the Islamists take over control? What will they do? Will they side with the with will they be willing to suffer martyrdom for being an apostate, or will they become aligned with the Islamists? That is the central question, I think. And Lutzer doesn't really address that in here, But I just thought that his statement at the bottom of page 209, I need to emphasize that the majority of Muslims who live in America and have come to accept Western values and have no interest in attacking America's religious history or economic system. I don't know if that would be the case if the Islamists take over. If the Islamists take over, I think it totally negates that particular statement. And because the nominal and the practicing Muslims who aren't interested in violence will be effectively forced to side with the Islamists. So anyway, that's the reason I asked that question. I appreciate the feedback. That's really good. Anybody have any comments or response to what I just said? Agree with that? Disagree? He makes a comment a little bit further, and so if you look at page 212, at the bottom of page 212, he says he's quoting David Horowitz here, and we'll have more to say about him in a minute. He says David Horowitz writes, according to every reputable survey, hundreds of millions of Muslims supported those attacks, talking about the attacks on 9/11. Hundreds of millions of Muslims supported those attacks. Well, if you have hundreds of millions of Muslims supporting the attacks, that seems to run a little bit contradictory with the statement on page 207 that the majority of Muslims who live in America have come to accept Western values. If they have come to accept Western values, and I realize he's talking about hundreds of millions around the world, but you have to ask, well, how many in the United States actually supported, the attacks? Well, in what category were they? Were they all Islamists? Well, I don't think so. Not necessarily. But he says hundreds of millions of Muslims supported those attacks, and tens of thousands of infidels had already died at the hands of Islamic terrorists. Yet President Obama denied that Islam had anything to do with these facts. So I just think those are two. That's one area where I don't think Lutzer really developed this as far as he should have or could have. I think he needed to kind of point out some of the things we just discussed a little bit better. Any comments on that? Okay. Well, let's move on to the next question here. What concepts do the Islamists, and there's a bunch of different organizations and groups that fall under the category, the umbrella title of Islamists. What concepts do the Islamists, that's CARE, the Council on American and Islamic Relations, which is nothing more than a front organization for Islamists, Muslim Brotherhood, and the project that he mentions, Sayyid Qutb, I guess that's how you pronounce that, I'm not sure. Stealth Jihad, Grand Jihad, he used a bunch of different terms and mentioned several different organizations and groups. So what concepts do these Islamists have in common with the secular left, the Marxists? And if you look at page 208 through 210, that's where you're going to find the responses or answers to that. Anybody want to take that one, or does anyone have a response to that? What concepts do the Islamists have in common with the secular left? The red-green alliance or red-green axis.
Steve, I think just reading from the text here, Lutzer talks about radical Islamists and radical secularists, believe in this utopia, the Muslims, believe in the religious utopia, and the radicals on the left, believe in the secular one. And what they have in common though is that they realize that their vision can't be fulfilled until the Christian influence and capitalism is destroyed. So it talks about them being a battering ram that can help de-Christianize America. As it talks about Pilate and Herod setting aside their differences and to kill their common enemy Jesus, and the famous quote, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, that's great, Caleb. Utopia was one of the things I had captured as well. I think the other key term that identifies something that they both share in common is the concept of social justice. If you've ever listened to much or read much about the Islamists, and we've talked about that a little bit in the past, one of the things that's so characteristic of the Islamists is they are constantly complaining about being oppressed, constantly oppressed. And so they find common ground with the movement for social, quote unquote, social justice. Anytime you see, a descriptor in front of the term justice, just, let red flags go up, because that means, okay, there's some agenda associated with the word justice that makes it injustice effectively. Uh, so social justice is something that the Islamists sort of can find common ground with the Marxists, the secular left, to link up with them for a common cause. And to your point, their goal their goal is to de-Christianize America, to take America down. America, as we have historically known it, up until until most recent history, uh, largely adhered to, for the most part, the aspirational values of our founding fathers. We could talk. That's a whole longer conversation, but for the most part, we still did. I think that's almost gone out the window at this point in time. But nevertheless, that's kind of been part of our history. That those founding values and the founding aspirational values that were part of our founding fathers' thinking and are embedded in our founding documents and our legal institutions and economic institutions, um, that that runs totally counter to the social justice utopian vision of the secular left and Islamists. So yeah, very good. The other terms that you'll hear are terms like equity, liberate, purification, redemption, you know, but they've completely twisted those terms in terms of what they mean. And it's in pursuit of a very ill-defined utopian goal. They have a utopia in mind, but it cannot be articulated. So anyway, that's good. All right, the next question is when or what event, I think is what I meant to type there, not even. When or what event led to the alignment of these two forces, that is the secular left and the Islamists, sometimes referred to as the red-green axis. The red is the Marxist, the green is the Islamist, on page 210. What event led to the alignment, I guess, or maybe exacerbated and moved forward the alignment of these two forces? And how? How did that event do that? Anybody want to talk about that or respond to that one? Page 210. Well, it was 9/11. What he talks about, or what he mentions here, I thought was very fascinating. He says the radical left eagerly accepted the Islamic narrative that this act of terrorism was America's fault. The terrorists did what oppressed people do. They attacked their enemies. When American flags were being flown in schools, office buildings, and lawns in a show of unity, the left began its assault on the flag, on patriotism, and on America in general. After a rant about how hateful America was, influential novelist Barbara Kingsolver wrote an op-ed piece on September 25th, just 14 days after the terror attack, in which she was critical of U.S. leaders who wanted to track down and punish the perpetrators. She asked, "Who are we calling terrorists here?" And then to continue, she said, "Patriotism threatens free speech with death. It is infuriated by thoughtful hesitation, constructive criticism of our leaders, and pleas for peace. It despises people of foreign birth who spent years learning our culture and contributing their talents to our economy." I don't know who she had in mind and what ivory tower she's been living in, but those are just divorced from reality comments. The left, moving down on page 211, the left defends radical Muslims, arguing that they have good reason to hate us. And he talks about the philosopher Noam Chomsky. Have you ever heard of Noam Chomsky? Anybody ever heard of him? No, Noam Chomsky? Anybody ever heard of him? I've heard of him a few times. Anybody know anything about him? Well, if you haven't, it's a name that you may hear from time to time. Have you ever heard of the Occupy Wall Street movement? he was heavily behind that. He's an anti-capitalist. He's pretty much anti-Israel. Um, he's really a radical leftist who sees everything wrong with America, everything wrong with her institutions, and that forms his view and response. He doesn't even identify with the aspirational values of the founding fathers at all. So um, Lutzer makes a comment here, or quotes actually from David Horowitz. He says David Horowitz writes, for 40 years, Noam Chomsky has turned out book after book, pamphlet after pamphlet, and speech after speech with one message, and one message alone. America is the great Satan. It is the fount of evil in the world. I think the other question I had here was, what other nation or what nation uses the term great Satan in reference to the United States? Anybody know? What nation uses the term Great Satan in reference to the United States? Here, no. David Horowitz is, yeah. Go ahead.
Iran.
Yeah, Iran. And who is the little Satan in Iran's view?
Israel.
Yeah, Israel. And Iran, it is the Shia Muslims who are in control of Iran, even though I believe there's a component of Iran that's Sunni, and well, really, I think that most of Iran is Sunni, but the leadership in Iran is Shia, and it's Shia eschatology that informs their policy, their foreign policy. And in their foreign policy, Shia eschatology is prominent. And within Shia eschatology, they can hasten the arrival of the Mahdi, which from a biblical perspective and from a Christian perspective is quite frankly none other than an antichrist-like figure. They can hasten the arrival of the Mahdi if they bring about a world conflagration. So Iran and the Shia eschatology that they embrace, the leadership that is, they desire to bring about a world conflagration through the use of nuclear weapons or any other kind of weapons, weapons of warfare. If they can bring about that world conflagration and bring it about perhaps by attacking the great Satan and then allowing the great Satan to respond against one of the world powers like Russia or China or some other power, then they will bring about that world conflagration that will hasten the arrival of the Mahdi. And that's their motivation behind their foreign policy endeavors. So it's totally insidiously evil, and yet our government in the past has sent pallets of money to Iran, and now under the current administration is trying to re-implement the arrangements with Iran that were put in place by the Obama administration. So it's what's going on right now is it's mind-boggling beyond belief as you get further into it. Well, anyway, he talks about Noam Chomsky. Let's see. And let me see. I had a few other things I wanted to mention about that. Let's see. Oh, at the bottom of page 212, I think I've already mentioned this. David Horowitz writes, according to every reputable survey, hundreds of millions of Muslims supported these attacks. That is the 9/11 attacks. And then at the top of page 213, you have Professor Nicholas de Genova at Columbia University said peace is not patriotic. Peace is subversive because peace anticipates a very different world than the one in which we live, a world where the U.S. would have no place. The cultural Marxists, that's what he's referring to, or he's using to refer to the Marxists, the secular left. The cultural Marxists believe the naive notion that people do evil only because they are oppressed. This gets into the oppressor dichotomy that is inherent to what's known as critical theory. Critical theory arose out of the Frankfurt School and in Germany, and then critical theory, as it began to be embraced by Marx and Engels, the oppressor narrative took on a class struggle in Marx and Engels' Das Kapital, and that class struggle began to be the basis of spreading Marxist ideology and Marxist systems throughout the world, where there was a class differential in countries. So wherever that class differential exists, you had those who had wealth and power, and you had those who were without wealth and power and who were impoverished, and there wasn't anything in between to speak of. When you had that kind of dichotomy, it played really well into the hands of the Marxists, who used the Marxist ideology and the critical theory underpinning it of the oppressed oppressor dichotomy to propagandize the masses to accept Marxist rule and Marxist systems in an attempt to overthrow those who were in the ruling class, when in fact what they were doing was overthrowing the ruling class that then existed and substituting it with another ruling class that was Marxist, who only wanted to exploit further the oppressed. But they wiggled their way into power, they wiggled their way into wealth, they wiggled their way into money by the propaganda of critical theory. So it was very class oriented in its implementation in many countries until it came to the United States. And in the United States, they couldn't really use the class issue. I'm going back decades and decades now. They couldn't really use the class issue in the United States because we had a vibrant middle class. And because we had a vibrant middle class, that just didn't work. That class warfare thing just didn't work. And not only that, the whole class, struggle narrative was not playing out the way Marx and Engels had envisioned it. And so when it came to America, it kind of got pushed back to a degree and deferred for a long period of time. And so those who are Marxists, I don't know exactly who they are, but those promoting this idea would include the academicians primarily. Those who are promoting critical theory in the United States realized they couldn't use class, so what did they do? They reverted to race. Yeah, there's our leverage point. The United States has a race issue. It goes all the way back to the Civil War. It goes all the way back to slavery. It goes all the way back to its founding. So they came up with what's known as a version of critical theory, which is really, now referred to as critical race theory. And so critical race theory is all over the place in the discussion in the news now, because it's effectively coming up. It's effectively putting in place a different type of racism to counter the perceived racism that is systemic and endemic to the white race in the United States. So that's what's behind a lot of this discussion that you see here in Lutzer, around page 213 and, and other pages to follow. So this oppressor dichotomy is inherent to critical theory, and it's just a matter of what gets leveraged as the oppressed and oppressor. One description of how insidious this is that once it gets sort of embraced by a large number of people through the educational system as it has today in the United States, it is almost impossible to falsify the ideology in the minds of those who have sort of embraced it passively. For instance, if someone says, well, if someone comes up to me and says, you're white, therefore you're a racist, and I say, no, I'm not a racist. Oh, the very fact that you're denying that you're a racist means you're a racist. And then what's your other alternative? Oh, yes, I'm a racist. So it's impossible to falsify the theory, because you can't reason, you can't have a logical discussion with those who are totally illogical, because why? They have thrown the truth completely out the window and they have no basis for a logical discussion. Everything's built around a lie. And so to try to have a logical discussion about these issues and a very reasoned discussion, you can't reason with people who have thrown the basis of reason out the window. Because even reasoning and anything involving objective like math, for instance. Math is even deemed racist. Anything involving, having a discussion with them to try to point out the error would be racist because now you, the oppressor, are trying to dominate me. I mean, this is how insidious this particular type of ideology happens to be. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I can give you several podcasts and authors to listen to substantiate what I just said. So I'm not accusing anybody of that. I'm just saying if anybody out there in the listening audience who listens to this recording in the future says, "Oh, Steve, that just sounds too crazy," please contact me and let me know if you think that, because I will be happy to refer you to some authors who have been interviewed on this very subject who have said exactly the same thing. So it's pretty crazy what we're dealing with, and honestly, this is the truth being turned into the lie, and the lie being turned into the quote unquote truth. And Scripture speaks to that, and speaks to that as being common in the future last days, which we are approaching, as indicated by what we're seeing in our society and culture today. Questions on that? Okay, let's see, page 213, another point of alignment. I think I've already talked to that one. It's really about the oppressed oppressor narrative. Let's see. In what way does and what examples does Lutzer? That's not a very well worded question, is it? In what way and in what examples does Lutzer provide in which the education system has been used to propagandize? Oh my goodness. Our indoctrination system, our propagandizing system known as our educational pipeline. It's amazing what's happened in that. That is our educational pipeline has turned into nothing but an indoctrination mechanism, a propagandizing mechanism. 214 to roughly 16. What examples and in what ways does Lutzer indicate that the education system has been used to propagandize? Anyone?
Yeah, Stevie, you just give several examples of there's a school in New Jersey that was showing videos to the students, like trying to proselytize to them, says
Mm-hmm.
you ain't intro to Islam and the five pillars. There's some other, and even like in Tennessee, which seems kind of surprising, like down in the South, but it gives an example of how some students were required to write, "There is no God but Allah and Muhammad is prophet."
Mm-hmm.
Some other examples of just the way textbooks are written, which talks about all of the glories of Islam, but it leaves out everything else, such as no mention of like 9/11 or what happened in some Christians and Muslim countries with all the beheadings and with what they um, how they treat women or their views on homosexuals, and it's not really their views but how they treat them, you know and
Mm-hmm.
but conversely, when they contrast Christianity, it's all the negatives about Christianity, and there's no positives to it.
Yeah, that's a great summary, Caleb. I mean, I think you hit on almost all the highlights there. Um, it was interesting. He made the comment on bottom of page. He's talking about the American Textbook Council. He mentions that several times there on page 215. The bottom of page 215 to 216 says the American Textbook Council report that should be read carefully. It says that the Council on Islamic Education now enjoys virtually unchecked power over publishers and is an agent of contemporary censorship informing publishers that it may, quote, decline requests for reviewing published materials unless a substantial and substantive revision is planned by the publisher. The taboo about teaching religion in schools, so zealously promoted by the ACLU and our courts, is conveniently set aside in deference to Muslim demands. Today, the tax dollars of American citizens are being used to build prayer rooms for Muslims in some public schools and ensure that halal foods, prepared according to standards set by Islamic law, are served in cafeterias. And organizations such as the Institute on Religion and Civic Values, formerly known as the Council on Islamic Education, provide federally funded materials to teach Islam in public schools. Videos are available that present a sanitized view of Islam and teach how the Quran can be used in daily life. Pretty amazing, huh? Pretty amazing. Down a little bit further, he says, he says the left celebrates not just teaching about Islam, but actively proselytizing for Islam in public schools. Why? The left here's his answer. His answer is that the left despises Christianity. Fundamentalist Islam has declared war on infidel cultures like America's, with its Judeo-Christian respect for individual liberty and constitutional restraints on the power of government. This particular little comment right here, the left despises Christianity, that is so true. What we have I just see a dark, dark cloud. Every time I think of Washington, D.C. today, I see nothing but a dark, dark cloud. And it's because there is no light there. There is, in terms of the current administration and all of its cronies, and the oligarchy that supports the figureheads there, it is like a dark cloud. And it's because they despise Christianity. They despise what Christianity represents. They despise what it promotes. And in that way, the secular left, the cultural Marxists, are in alignment with the Islamists. So, since I would say over the past few years, the whole Muslim scene, the Islam, and by the way, I want to qualify and make sure I'm clear on this. What we're talking about here in terms of Muslims is the Muslim belief system and religion itself, and those Islamists who are very, very evil. But the people who are Muslims that are just out here, that are in the first couple of categories that we just talked about, that you may run into at work, you may run into in your dealings in life, that you are able to have a conversation with, please, when you have conversations with them, treat them like Jesus would treat them, and try to keep a door open for conversations that might allow you to share the gospel with them. And if you're in the vicinity of Muslims at work, where you live, or in your different engagements where you're actually coming into contact with Muslims, I would highly encourage you to get really educated on Islam. And there's a lot of good books out there, and I can help you find them on how to witness to Muslims. And I would definitely do a little bit of research on that, so you can be prepared to, in fact, engage in an evangelistic way with individual Muslims. So in terms of our individual relations, let's set that aside. I'm kind of pushing that to the side so we can have this larger discussion about Islamists and what's happening in the red-green axis that's occurring in our country, and how that's evil, and it's empowered by Satan. It is demonically influenced, and it is totally anti-biblical in terms of what they're doing and the policies that they're pursuing. So that's what this is all about, is highlighting that larger perspective of what it could do to the United States, and what does that mean for where the future is headed. Because if right now the United States has been serving sort of like the dam that's holding back the huge body of water that's behind it, and that body of water is very destructive if it's let loose all at once. And if you take, and that body of water represents the other powers in this world that don't recognize the principles that our country was founded on that are consistent with scriptural principles that allow for freedom, private property, individual liberty, freedom to worship, First Amendment, protected free speech, practice of religion, that allow for all of those freedoms that have given us so much prosperity and given us the ability um, to practice our faith and send missionaries into the rest of the world. If the dam breaks, the water that's behind it, that represents powers like China, Russia, and the the agenda of the globalist, elitist, Marxists, all of that is going to come rushing down, rushing downstream, and it has a very, very destructive force. And it's going to find a point of settlement at some point. And the United States is not in the picture, and not going to be a part of the picture. It will have been destroyed with the force of that water. So the world will look very, very different once that dam breaks. And it will not be anything like the world that we have known in all of our lifetimes. And that's what the future holds as the stage continues to be set. At some point in the future, that dam is going to break. Because from what I see, we don't have an indefinite amount of resistance in this country that exists currently to keep that from happening. We've got a certain amount of resistance. The question is, will the resistance hold? Will the resistance hold, and for how long? That's the big question. 10 years? Till the end of this decade? The next 5 years? I don't know. I cannot see, and I cannot foresee the resistance holding for 20 or 30 more years. I can't see that. So the whole purpose of this is to prepare us for what's on the other side and help us prepare our hearts and our minds and our thinking for what is on the other side. And what's on the other side of the dam breaking is not a pretty picture. So, all right. So we talked about the education system, how it's been used to propagandize. If you didn't get a chance to read that, I would highly recommend reading through that. It's very, very insightful. All right, let's go to what is the Islamist doctrine of immigration? And we'll wrap this up real quickly. Islamist doctrine of immigration. He really, it boils down to what he says on at the top of page 218. Anybody want to comment on that, or really anything else in that section on the Muslim doctrine of immigration? Anybody want to comment on that?
Hey, Steve,
Mm-hmm.
I thought this was interesting, and it kind of reminded me of when I was in Afghanistan and kind of the shift in policy, later in the war, which seemed like so. Um, I'm really glad that we went through this because I didn't really think about it until I read this, but it completely made sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, obviously they want to, you know, immigrate, into the United States and other Western countries to gain influence. But it's not in the traditional, influence that we've seen in the past. I mean, they don't want to come down here and knock down buildings anymore and set off bombs. It's exactly what they're doing right now that we talked about before with the alliance of the left, and um, it's really about winning hearts and minds of
Mm-hmm.
the people. In the same way when we were in Afghanistan, we realized that, hey, just by killing more people, it's not going to solve this problem. We've got to win the hearts and
Mm-hmm.
minds of these people over here to actually win the war. And so they figured that out too. That hey, because although we talked about some of the ways that the left mischaracterized the events of 9/11, in reality, for a large percent of the population, I mean, that was a unifying event,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people got behind the the United States to go over there and and drop some bombs and go and after the people in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think that they realized that, hey, if we just continue to do that, if we just wage jihad, against the great Satan, the infidels, that we're not going to meet our objectives because we're just going to unify them against us. But if they take this softer approach and try to assimilate and unify with the left, make people feel like they're still the oppressed people, then there's a much larger example or a much larger chance that they'll be successful.
Yeah, and I think this is one sentence here pretty much sums up what you just said, Caleb. On page 218, he says this model of migration. He's referring to the hijra. Hijra is the Islamic term for migration. This model of migration is not for the purpose of it, and he uses the term migration. He doesn't use the term immigration. It's migration. And that's a very important distinction. This model of migration is not for the purpose of assimilating into a new host nation, but for the colonization and transforming of the host country. That right there is the key sentence, and it pretty much wraps up in one sentence what you were just saying, which is they're not coming over here to assimilate. They're migrating throughout Europe, Western Europe, and into the United States for the purpose of colonizing. So it's like they've completely, like to your point, they've completely used what we were doing over in the Afghanistan and over in the Middle East, and they've completely adopted it for their own purposes. However, it really preceded what we were doing. They started this hijra traces its origins all the way back to Muhammad when he went from Mecca to Medina, and he talks about that in this particular chapter. So the model of migration is not for the purpose of assimilating into a new host nation, but for colonizing and transforming host countries. Very important, sentence, I think. And then one other comment. I don't have a question on this, but he talks about the deception of political correctness, and this is where, boy, I tell you what, that we could talk a lot more about this, but on page 219, he says, because our national security agencies have become paralyzed by multiculturalism and obsessions with diversity, investigations into the extent of the jihad agenda have been hindered. No one wants to appear anti-Muslim, and this has led to serious lapses in national security. Boy, I'd say so too. In the security report, Sharia, the Threat to America, abridged version, the authors conclude, multiculturalism, political correctness, misguided notions of tolerance, and sheer willful blindness have combined to create an atmosphere of confusion and denial in America about the current threat confronting the nation. They concur that the breaches in our security systems are nothing short of criminal. Islamophobia is a word invented by a Muslim to shame anyone who is critical of Islam, even if the criticism is factually accurate. Then the response of the church. And my question was, how should the church respond? And that's on pages 220 to 223. And I'll just quickly, hit a couple of highlights here. He said the church must equip believers to engage followers of Islam, fully understanding their history, beliefs, and goals. In other words, be wise as a serpent and innocent as doves. Be innocent as doves as you deal with Muslims individually, but be wise as serpents when you're looking at it from a policy and what's happening in this world perspective. We should view Muslims as people misled and deceived by a false religion. That's how we should view individual Muslims. We shouldn't be out here trying to, badmouth them, berate them. They don't know. It's the tiger with the stripes. The tiger has the stripes, and it'd be like berating the tiger for having stripes, right? The individual Muslims, as long as they're not out here trying to destroy you directly, and as long as you can have a conversation with them, view them as people who are deceived by a false religion and a false ideology, just like we should everybody else, and don't treat them as the enemy from a spiritual perspective, when Satan and this deceptive lies that he has promulgated is the real enemy that we need to confront. And we can confront that by by objectifying the discussion, by engaging in discussions with Muslims that basically objectify the discussions. And that's a whole, another discussion about how to witness to Muslims, or quite frankly, it's the same technique and same process and procedure that you use with anybody, no matter whether they're Muslim or just another American that you happen to be talking with. Everybody who's not being transformed by the truth in the Word has false beliefs, right? To some extent, and certainly an unbeliever that's been sucked into such a deceptive religion as Islam has a lot of false beliefs, and we can't fault them, individually for having false beliefs, because what choice do they have? They're going to have false beliefs. So don't treat them like the enemy until they are the enemy, right? And you're in a situation where they are the enemy. The church must equip believers to engage followers of Islam, fully understanding their history, beliefs, and goals. Let's see. I must warn against the growing trend for churches to have interfaith dialogue with Muslims. And he had some very good comments here about how insidious these interfaith dialogues can be. He says from the Muslim point of view, the goal of the interfaith dialogue is stated stated by this one Muslim cleric, Sayyid Qutb. The chasm between Islam and, I think the way you pronounce that is Jahila, the society of unbelievers, is great, and a bridge is not to be built across so that people on the two sides may mix with each other, but only so that people of Jahiliyyah, the society of unbelievers, may come over to Islam. In other words, from an Islamic perspective, the only reason you engage in these interfaith dialogues is to pull those people into Islam. From a Muslim perspective, the interfaith dialogue double talk is acceptable and even necessary. The goal is to present an inviting but false narrative of Islam, making it palatable and acceptable to Western audiences and casually committed Christians. He mentions that he took time to read the Interfaith Dialogue, a guide for Muslims, and is a book written by Muslims and for Muslims. It speaks in very neutral tones. They talk about fairness, politeness, careful listening, and the need for coexistence. You ever see those bumper stickers, coexist? The goal of the book is to teach Muslims how to present their faith in a way that would make it acceptable to non-Muslims. He says, read this carefully. Each dialogue partner, this is a quote, each dialogue partner has the right to define his or her own religion and beliefs so that the rest can only describe what it looks like to them from the outside. And again, these seminars should address both Christian and Muslim beliefs and provide a comparative view of each without attempting to judge between the two. The bottom line, Muslim participants in interfaith dialogue want an uncontested platform where they can present a version of Islam without undesirable references from the Quran or Islam's aggressive and bloody history. In other words, a critical analysis of the respective religions is discouraged. So you can't engage in a critical analysis of Islam in these interfaith dialogues. If you begin to step over into a critical analysis, now you're stepping into the role of oppressor, and you're going to be accused of being the oppressor. Why? Because you're pointing out the inconsistencies in their and the errors in their particular religion. All right. Well, I'll leave the rest of that to you. Anybody have any other comments before we close out? How should the church respond? Did anybody else catch anything that you wanted to comment on there in that section? All right. One comment at the bottom of page 223. I'll just share this with you and we'll close out here. He says, we probably will not be faced with martyrdom here in America, but we have to ask whether the church will be courageous enough to withstand the cultural and legal pressures that secularism is determined to impose upon us as Islam expands its influence and asserts its rights, quote unquote, which so often conflict with our rights. Will political correctness and laws that prohibit the criticism of Islam, blasphemy laws, paralyze the church? Already, criticism of Islam, no matter how accurate and thoughtful, is taboo in the wider culture. Well, it's a great chapter. Hopefully that summary and that discussion maybe helped you process some of the contents of it a little bit more. That's certainly the objective of our discussions, and I really appreciate your attendance, participation, and engagement in this. Before I close out in prayer, anybody have any comments before we close out? Any thoughts? Hopefully you're enjoying this. We only have 2 chapters left. Any thoughts, questions, comments? Liking it? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. Let me close out in prayer, and I hope to see you Sunday, okay? Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful book that Lutzer has prepared and how it helps us to think through so much of what we see going on in our culture around us, and it educates us. It helps us to gain the type of knowledge that allows us to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Thank you so much for that, Heavenly Father. And thank you for everybody that's taken the time to participate and listen tonight. And then those that'll listen to the recording in the future, thank you so much for them and the opportunity to have this type of a venue to share the truth. We pray this in our Lord and Savior's precious name. Amen. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you Sunday, okay? Bye-bye now.